Hi, everybody. In today's episode, we're talking about stigma, and I wanted to give a bit of a trigger warning for folks in case some of the discussion topics that we bring up might bring up some potential trauma for folks or memories or whatnot. We'll be referring to topics including assisted suicide, abortion, eugenics, and other areas that have contributed to sort of stigma in individual disabilities, and want to just give everybody a chance to stop playing if some of those topics might be problematic. Thanks very much, and hope you enjoy the episode.
Welcome to the Behavior Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Welcome to another episode of the Behavior Speak podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ben. Today in the studio, we've got Dr. Rocco Catrone with us. Kind of found Rocco online doing some interesting research. Kind of in the area of stigma. I recently had on the podcast as well Dr. Maya Kolich, who is a researcher out in Hawaii who's been doing a lot of really cool stuff in stigma. So I thought it was a nice match to get a couple different perspectives on it. Dr. Kolich, she kind of was looking at sort of just general sort of analysis of stigma in terms of folks with disabilities, but Rocco has actually done a study around a sort of a potential sort of preliminary intervention for stigma, which is really cool. So I'm looking forward to kind of digging into that. The paper that we're going to be talking about today was published in the journal Behavior and Social Issues. You can subscribe to that through IBAO. And the article is called A Behavioral Approach to Increasing Perceptions of Capability Towards People with Disabilities. And so you can start to see how kind of this concept of capability and stigma are connected, but we'll be digging into that. So anyway, thanks for being on the show, Rocco.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having us. And thank you for the connection with that. So actually, after we started talking, Maria and Dr. Baez, we all connected afterwards, and we'll be actually working on a paper together. So
that's amazing.
Because of your podcast, we all connected. That was great.
Oh, that makes me feel so good. Thanks for sharing that little anecdote. I love that. I actually have had a couple of folks connecting through the podcast, so I think it was a side benefit that I didn't expect. So I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what you folks put together, and I'll have to bring all three of you back to talk about that one.
Hey, there we go.
Fantastic. So Rocco, before we kind of get into the research and into your work, I always like to get a little bit of an origin story of folks, kind of find out how they got in the field, how they kind of developed the interest, and kind of got to where they were. So you wouldn't mind kind of telling us your ABA story, that'd be amazing.
Of course, yeah. So I don't know, it's kind of roundabout, I guess. When I went to school for university at first, I really kind of wanted to focus on being a physician assistant. I was either doing that or being a firefighter. And throughout that time, I went through EMT training. I was ready to go. I was working on an ambulance for a little bit. And over the summer, I was kind of looking for just a different job, just get a different experience. Being an EMT there was just a different patient connection that I was looking for, and working with people and kind of seeing what that was like. I didn't know if that was a long-term thing. And one of my professors suggested, hey, why don't you work at the school for autistic children? And I said, all right, that seems interesting. I didn't know what, I never really had a lot of contact before, and going there's Giant Steps of Illinois. I got to work with a variety of folks. So social workers, behavior analysts, they had a psychologist on staff at the time too, different teachers, and really kind of promoted the idea of, inclusive education, inclusive practices. And the BCBA was also really, really solid on, I honestly would say ahead of her time. I mean, this was like 12, 13 years ago. Really focusing on, is this a goal that's going to be relevant for this person? And how do we support someone and keep them happy and doing the things that they want to do without us always defining that? So her name was Lindsay. She was wonderful, 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 wonderful human. And that kind of shaped the way early on how I saw behavior analysis. And yeah, I mean, went from there, worked at a couple in-home companies, worked at a hospital for a while, doing different things. The hospital experience was really interesting, just, inpatient unit stuff, direct patient care. And, I always want to be careful using the term patient. So we've served a lot of folks. And now I'm a assistant professor and doing some community work, doing some research, and connecting with students.
Really cool. Really cool. Yeah, I like. I know this isn't a surprise to me. It's because we've been chatting a bit already. But I love the EMT firefighter connection that you and I have, and that you kind of started with that, and I've kind of just added that sort of later in the game. Did some of has that training at all, or that experience sort of been helpful in your work in any way?
In a couple different ways. Like when I reflect on it a little bit, just, I don't know, after our own conversations, I really started digging into kind of my memories on that. And I think in many ways it did. There's, part of it was just understanding the human body in some cases, and like understanding, things like what does pain look like for different people. And that kind of taught me, pain isn't just everybody sitting there and saying ow or holding something. Pain can look like shaking. Pain can look like sweating. Pain can look like staring off. And that's really useful, especially working with individuals that aren't, that don't have the same communicative style that I do to express those things. So that's been a huge piece. But also just from like I don't know how to say, it's like a logistics standpoint. Being able to think in the moment is huge. As I know you and I've had conversations about, but being able to think in the moment, but then also being very aware of your own reactions. So like, what are you saying? Where is your body? How are you doing things? So, both of those things were hugely, hugely beneficial just in the care. And like really looking back on that, I mean, that's really something that kind of shaped a lot of the like initial approaches that I do. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the base of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And at some point, I think that'd be cool. And if there's anyone out there that's listening, that maybe in sort of a similar situation to Rocco and I in terms of, maybe practicing as a first responder, I've been curious to hear if anyone's ever applied some of the the ABA concepts to their work. I mean, for you, obviously, it kind of started with EMT and kind of went into that. For me, I should be, but I haven't done a lot of it. It does help me kind of. I think sort of reversing the question, how does ABA help being a firefighter? I think it definitely does, and certainly in terms of de-escalation and certainly remaining calm and sort of all those pieces. But also I think I know I've worked with a lot of folks that have really struggled, certainly in terms of dealing with first responders and being really triggered by that. And so maybe there's different things we can kind of look at there. But one thing that you said just briefly, I think we'll probably dig more into this, but it was sort of trying to avoid using terms to kind of describe the folks we're working with. And I think that is that's gonna, and I don't want to dig into this too much yet because we're going to later, but, I think that really feeds into the whole stigma piece. But at the same time, I find sometimes folks are constantly jumbling their words sort of out of a fear to offend. And I think, and I maybe I'll get letters for this, but I think that in the context of a hospital or in the context of a, as a first responder or an ambulance, I think it's okay to label folks as patients. I think because that's what they are in those contexts. I think it's that context relation. The key is to sort of not, use that same terminology, I think, in other contexts. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. So kind of thinking on that, the first thing that pops into my head is more of like a medicalized model of disability, and thinking
Yes.
of, like treating the symptom, and
Yes.
especially in those cases. And I, you know, I think especially in, EMT first responder component, it's there's not a lot of relationship building.
Mm-hmm.
There is a fair amount, that you have to do,
Mm-hmm.
that you have to make sure that, the person is safe around you as much as possible. But in those stressful situations, I mean, you're really there to treat the symptoms, or,
Mm-hmm.
at least as an EMT paramedic, I mean, you're there to hold off until, hopefully help the person get to the place that has other professionals to prolong that person's life.
Yes.
Um, yeah, so I think like in those cases and in the hospital system, maybe that fits a little bit more because those work more under medicalized models of disability.
Yes.
Um, and for better or for worse, I don't know if there's a right answer associated with that, but I wonder if that's kind of where that delineation is.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think you're right. And I think you know, I think the problem isn't so much the term patient, but it's
Hmm.
more the sort of, it's that sort of lack of connection you're talking about.
Hmm. Hmm.
Once you start labeling someone as a number
Hmm.
or an item or whatever versus Bill or Mike or whatever,
Yeah,
it sort of changes that relationship. But I think it's understandable. But it was just I think it's great that you're aware of those terms, because I do see those terms used in kind of other settings. I've seen them used in sort of behavioral intervention, RBT kind of context, to therapist
hmm,
patient relationship and stuff, and I think that can be certainly problematic. But we'll kind of maybe
agreed.
touch on that a little bit. We're talking about stigma here, and my hope is to release Maria's episode before yours, because it was recorded beforehand. But on the off chance, with my ADHD, I forget the order and release yours first. Maybe we can just do
I understand that.
a little bit of review of kind of uh, of uh, of what stigma actually is. What does it mean?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is nobody really knows. Um, there's a lot of conceptualizations of it, and I think, especially if you're coming at it from a behavioral standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
you know, what are some of those overt and covert behaviors that people are engaging in that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, have some kind of endpoint to it. So maybe you think of stigma as like a functional component. Maybe there's some RFT component to it where like there's a frame of coordination with, incapability. If you have something like, okay,
Mm.
that person looks like Y, or has this ability like this, or believes in this, or functions like this. And, based on your learning history, either, contingency shaped or rule governed, you kind of form these new connections. And sometimes those connections are not very adaptive or not very
Mm-hmm.
accepting and inclusive of the other person. And even if you have, there's a lot of like implicit studies associated with this where it's like, wow, I took the IAT and I am super racist. And,
Mm-hmm.
you can have those thoughts, but not act on them,
Mm-hmm.
and you can have those thoughts and start kind of reflecting like, oh, that was weird. Where did that come from?
Mm-hmm.
And, start addressing that privately, and then publicly, talking with other people about your experiences, maybe talking with folks who are accepting of this with lived experiences, and starting to kind of loosen some of those like prejudicial and stigmatic frames, and, you know,
Mm-hmm.
adding a new set of information. So I don't know. I think for me, at least, stigma is that kind of interaction between your overt and covert behaviors. So, what are your initial reactions versus what you're actually doing,
Mm-hmm.
and what has been contingency shaped, from your environment, people
Yeah.
saying yes, no, or I don't know what news channel you watch, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And what has been reinforced and punished over time
Mm-hmm.
versus, okay, now I have this base from when I was a kid, having this contingency shaped, how am I going to expand this out and interact with people in the world? So it's,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a complex system with many, many pieces. And I don't know. I don't know if behavior analysis is the one to answer it, but I think we have a technology that could at least assist with that and collaborate with other fields to understand what that is a little bit better so that we can actually target it instead of making a lot of assumptions on how to decrease it.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And actually, I think we're gonna dig in a little bit, because part of your paper actually takes a deep dive of sort of an RFT analysis of stigma, and so I'll ask that question shortly. I also recall again from a previous interview that it's interesting the origin, sort of the origin of the word stigma. I think a lot of folks, some folks, if they come from sort of religious backgrounds, might sort of connect this to sort of the stigmata, of sort of, the idea of the crucifixion and people sort of blood appearing on the hands and feet and whatnot. But more so, it comes from the term for it's Latin for it's a literal mark, so an actual, whether it be the blood or some sort of branding or engraving or tattoo or whatever, that's placed on a person and signifies that person is less valued than everyone else. That's kind of where that term originates, and and certainly makes me think of things like the Holocaust and with the stars and the tattooing and some of those difficult situations where folks were literally branded as being less than, and so that's sort of carried over to now.
Exactly.
We don't see this in the paper, but in the preprint that came out, and I think that may still be available to some folks if you're like on ResearchGate or whatnot for this article. And as folks know, preprints often are quite a bit longer. Actually, sorry. Before I touch on that, I just remembered you also referred to just for folks understanding, because you mentioned EAT and then becoming super racist. So just for folks that don't know what that is, that's the implicit association test, right? That's what you're referring to.
Yep. And essentially you just have, a bunch of stimuli in front of you. So different people, different, sometimes there's like control stimuli associated with that too, like a tree or something. And you have to say, like how likely are you to X? So like there's IRAP versions. So, which is kind of like the RFT version of the IAT. And you essentially look at the stimuli and respond to whatever question they have on there. Sometimes it's yes, no. Yes. Sometimes it's, which word is more associated with this person or this picture, and so on and so forth.
Yes, gotcha. And folks can get a little more information on the IAD and get some links and whatnot. In a previous episode I did with Dr. Victoria Suarez, because she did a paper on again sort of an RFT connection on racial biases, and she talks a lot about the IATs and the different versions there, so folks can check that out. Going back to what I was going to get at though, in the preprint, there was a nice section in the beginning that didn't make it into publishing that reviewed some phenomena that may perpetuate stigma, and I've already recorded, and it will have already played a trigger warning for folks, just because we are going to talk about sort of some things that may trigger folks as far as relating to stigma, some sort of historical things and just sort of phenomena on kind of how poorly folks are treated in certain situations, and so I was hoping we could kind of touch on those a little bit. Just because these are concepts that up until sort of reading your preprint, I was not actually aware of some of these, and now since I've read that, and since you and I have talked a few times, a lot of these have kind of come up a lot more, and these terms, particularly this first one, and so I was hoping you might be able to just describe them and maybe talk a little about kind of how they relate to stigma. The first one was this thing called othering. What's othering?
Yeah, so I mean, the short version of it is kind of goes back to like the labeling component that you talked about, like with the roots of what stigma is. And it's, you're literally utilizing your vocalizations to make someone different or separate someone from a particular group, usually your own, right? Like those other people are doing this, or they, not us, and you start using like all these words, so kind of the language connection with that. And that then very much leads to different things where it's like, well, we aren't doing this, right? They are doing this, or we have this expectation that they are not meeting. And that further separates out people. I mean, just in the language that we have. So then if you're creating some kind of frame of coordination there or something along those lines, you're a connection, you're like, well, if they're not part of my group, then maybe I shouldn't reach out to them for something, right? For connection, for socialization. Or if, you're making policies and you think that this group doesn't need this or can't access this or doesn't deserve this, in some cases. And, with recent legislation across the country, in the US right now, there's a lot of shenanigans going on. That's not okay. Don't want to dive too far into that. But it's lack of resources then that leads to. So those conversations lead to ideologies, and ideologies lead to direct policy changes. And sometimes it works in people's favor and people get stuff, and sometimes they're put into a different group. And then that group is othered. Group is the other side that doesn't have access to the resources. So it's spooky, like what is allowed to happen and what types of conversations and language can happen behind closed doors that have very real life effects on the people that they're supposed to be affecting positively.
Yeah, it's really dehumanizing, and it actually, in a way, kind of reminds me of our earlier sort of exchange around the term patient and just these kind of labeling terms. I see this a lot in kind of adult residential settings where it's the staff and the residents, and instead of it just being sort of people who live at this house that we're supporting, these residents are all kind of just automatically put into a category, and a lot of assumptions are made. I just released yesterday episode 35 with Dr. Denny Reed, and he gave one example that I had never even considered, was that which I think could be an interesting example of othering. He talked about how he went and visited a group home once. I think they do an assessment or whatnot, and when and this was, I think, in his earlier days, and he entered the group home, and the residents were all around his age. So he was a young researcher, probably just finished his doctorate or whatever, probably probably around your age, and the residents of the group home were also about the same age, and he noticed when he went in that he was introduced as Mr. Reed. So maybe this was pre Ph.D., but anyway, he was introduced as Mr. Reed. And then the resident, who was the same age or maybe a little bit older, was introduced as Bob. And and Danny was just sort of analyzing and noticing that it was an interesting dynamic that he, as the visitor, gets sort of this, more professional, sort of dignified Mr., where the resident in the home is automatically first name basis. And it's a small thing. I mean, it's not like sort of patient or labeling someone as, on their behavior, which has maybe some other really problematic issues. But it just goes to show how easily, we get into this kind of othering.
Yeah. And sometimes we don't even think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, that right there, creates a power differential between people. And just like, as you said, it's, I guess no different when people say, well, I should say it's very different in many cases, but it's like when, you're a professor in a classroom and it's like, oh, my name's Dr. This. What's your name? Oh, my name's Tom. And it's like, well, we could refer to each other by our first names. That's okay. I've myself, I really try to stray away from the doctor title. Every once in a while they say, and I'm like, okay, that's fine. I don't know. I've grown accustomed to my first name, but beside that, it's little things like that though, that add up, a lot of these, like, components of stigma and prejudice. It's not this, like, one day I was fine and now today I have a ton of stigma towards this person, which I'm sure there might be some cases of that with a variety of different things, but that's another conversation. It's those little things that build up over time and slowly solidify those frames of, I am better than X, or this person has a different stature in society, and you associate different statures with what that person can do and what that person is allowed to do to other people, honestly, and I think little things like that add up to not inclusive programming and, leads to therapists going in saying, well, I'm the behavior analyst. I am the expert, and you're already othering everybody else in there. And that's just a recipe for disaster.
No, absolutely. I recommend, if folks aren't familiar with the term othering, to dig into it. There's some really good stuff out there. I'll see if I can find it for the show notes. There was an article I read recently. There's a couple autistic researchers that have been doing a lot of really interesting kind of studies on othering and that sort of perspective. And so I think it's really worth a dive, because I think it's a real big barrier, and I don't think it's something that we consider at all, sort of, in the way we do a lot of our intervention. And this, and all of this kind of goes back to some of these ideas of reform, that I think that our field is looking at, and it's not all just about whether ABA, I'm not going to dive into this too much, but it's not all about whether it's ABA is abuse or not abuse or all that sort of stuff. There's lots of other issues, like these sort of really kind of what seem like kind of minute details, calling me Mr. versus my first name doesn't seem like a big deal, but you combine them all together and do that over years and years of intervention and repetition, and you're putting these people into compartments that maybe they didn't need to be in. So yeah, I think that's really interesting to think about. There's another one you talk about, which I never really considered, and because I know I used to do these myself when I first kind of got in the field, and I was trying to sort of train my staff to sort of. I think the goal is to try to create some empathy, to sort of try to understand what some of the folks you're supporting are going through and feeling. But at the same time, it can be problematic. And it's this idea of simulation exercises. What are these, and how can these be problematic?
Yeah, so I think at the beginning, simulation exercises were touted as like this awesome thing. Like, how can I alter my body to get a more direct experience of a disability? Like, do I bind my hands and then try to work with something, so kind of simulating someone that doesn't have very good use of their hands, or at least to the level that they would prefer, unless they do prefer that. But there's wearing different goggles for like sight considerations, maybe wearing headphones for hearing considerations, things along those lines. And on the outset, it looks nice and fluffy, and people are like, "Whoa, I'm really experiencing what this person does." And to a certain extent, maybe it does, and you kind of get a different perspective. But the thing that happens, I feel like, with a lot of these components are, one, who is actually giving those simulation trainings? Because if it's someone without that lived experience, and someone says like, "All right, here's headphones, and now you can't really hear anything, and this is exactly what it's like," and if you've never had that lived experience, you don't know what it's like. So, I think that's a huge issue with a lot of those trainings that people do. I mean, you should have people with lived experience talking about these things, and if they feel comfortable sharing what that might feel like, maybe that's what it is. But that could be a huge issue on that end. But then on the other end too, if you're like receiving the training and you say, "Well, I know exactly what it feels like. I remember this one time that blah, 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 blah." And, like, "I went through the simulation training and it totally changed my life, and I know exactly how you feel." And it's like, well, cool. You went through 15 minutes of something that someone experiences in their life. And it's almost always in a negative light of like, "Oh, look how impaired this person is. Look at this less than, look at this, issue, this, how bad is this?"
Yes.
And, there's a lot of pieces where people are not seeing this as a negative thing. There's a disability identity theory, and people's identities and ownership of, whatever disability or impairment, or how that person perceives that, is something that's missing from a lot of those pieces. I think for myself, I'm pretty open about my own disability identities with ADHD, but then also some cognitive impairments with, when I was younger, I had cancer when I was very, very young, 6 months old. And through a lot of the chemotherapy, the theory was, it was affecting my developing brain. And it's harder for me to learn things and stay focused, and that there's just a lot of components to that. And throughout school, I had supports. I didn't really have, a lot of IEP support until a little bit later in, grammar school. And then I had 504 in high school, but I already had my own conceptualization of like, this is bad. I should not be acting like this. And I never used them, and my grades suffered, you know, we should make those equitable systems in there. So, if I'm doing a training and I'm talking about like, what does that feel like for me, trying to recall something, is almost like having a bunch of, like at a library where they used to have like the index cards, to try to find a book, for me, it's like, I can't always remember where I put the information, for lack of a better term.
Yes.
And I'm opening the drawer and I find it in drawer number 4. And I'm like, oh, sweet. Here you go. Here's the card. The drawer is closed. And they're like, oh, can you get me that card again? I'm like, oh shit, I don't know where,
yes,
where the next thing is. And then I'm going through drawer 1, 2, 3. So, doing stuff like that, sometimes thinking more quickly, and, that works for me. And that's an example I give because I feel comfortable with that because I have direct lived experience with that. But if some people are like, well, this is what the pain feels like, or this is what the sight is, and this is what hearing is. And, if I don't have, like, I'm not going to be doing that because engaging in that kind of perpetuates that stigma and perpetuates that, like, I don't know, if you don't have the lived experience, you don't know what you're talking about. You can have sympathy, but there's only so much you can do.
Yeah, no, and you and I have had some really good chats about our. I always forget how much we have in common with the ADHD, and I didn't have cancer as a child, but I suspect I had a brain injury as a child. I had a short story as something large and heavy landed on my head, and I never when I was 4, and I never went to the hospital, and I was never treated for it. And I'm pretty sure that has had some effects kind of long term, and I do definitely can relate to your library index card problem. I think for me, I don't even know where any of the index cards are still. The next one is interesting too, and we've been hearing more and more about this. I think especially with with the advent of things like TikTok and whatnot, a lot of folks have come out and kind of really spoke against this in terms of one term I've heard. There's one particular individual, and I can't recall her name. You may know that speaks a lot on inspiration porn, they call it, and it kind of relates to this idea of sort of disabled heroes, and I think there's a term that's been called like super crips is a phrase I've heard. I think that may come out of a movie. What's this all about?
Netflix special,
right?
Yeah, so in that component, and there's a really I believe her name's Stella Young. She does a really, really good TED Talk about this, and
yes,
I encourage everybody to check that out. And essentially it's saying like one of the examples on there I thought was, really good. It was an individual that was swimming, like it was kind of like a shot from underneath. The person had a surfboard and they had a prosthetic leg. And they said, well, if this person can do it, so can you. And, it's almost like saying like, well, this person is, impaired and not to the top level of what you are. You are already better than this person. It's kind of the assumption. And, like stuff like that, like makes for, stories that people can get behind, or like, oh, they've overcome so much. And it's like, well, no, I just kind of live my life. I mean, even, within people I've had contact with in the past, it's, like, oh, you've overcome so much with cancer, with your learning impairment, and now you have a Ph.D. and look where you're at. Like, oh, you've overcome this. And it's not that. I mean, it's like what have you overcome? I'm still there. Like I still have, difficulties with things, and I found, workarounds and people that would support me along the way, to be able to do that, and I'm, and fortunate that I had those support structures, and many people don't. And so like this idea of, this like, wow, that's just so inspiring that you just live your life like this. Oh my gosh, I can't even imagine, is very belittling. And it's basically saying like, wow, like if I were you, I would just be so sad. It's kind of like the undercurrent. And it just, I don't know. It's hugely, infantilizing in many ways. It's, it's just uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to do that. So, but it's perpetuated. And it's, having, folks with disabilities being, like heroes, like, oh, despite that, the fact that this person's in a wheelchair, they're able to do all these things. And, which is just, I don't know. I mean, like I said before, it really comes back to that component of, you are less than, you're operating less than what the environment sees as, the gold standard, and you manage to get things done. I'm very surprised that you're able to do that, like form relationships or get degrees or have romantic partners.
Yes.
I mean, it's pervasive.
And certainly that last example in particular, and I think we could do a whole episode on, which I'm actually hoping to bring someone on to talk about that. But the idea that kind of how stigma plays in a role, and how we essentially just don't allow. We're not even open to the idea of sort of folks with maybe a moderate, for lack of a better term, level of disability with having a romantic partner. The idea that could even be possible, is not even in a lot of folks' brains. I think we're starting to see some more examples of folks that are showing that, that's not only possible, but normal. And we're seeing some shows coming out, like a most recent one, I think, the U.S. I think just recently released the U.S. version of Love on the Spectrum, which I hear is a great show on Netflix. And we're starting to see sort of more examples of for lack of a better term, the normalcy of folks, that it's not it's not strange that folks would be able to achieve sort of these things, and it's not so heroic and special anymore, but it's still a problem, and I can see how it contributes.
Well, I mean, how much of that is, stigma, just especially around the idea of like love, romantic partnership, or just close, intimate, not always sexual, but just intimate social connection with other people. And, how there's this expectation like, well, you need to work on yourself and be 100% so that somebody else can love you, and that you can have the ability to love someone else. When, folks that have been together for a really long time, I mean, like, I don't know, I think of, and I'm not the gold standard here, so please, anybody listening to this don't, like my wife and I have been together for 13 years, and we've, and like we're young, like we started in high school, and we've grown a lot together, and have seen a lot of crap, and have, it wasn't pretty, and it wasn't like, oh, we were ready to do this. So then we already place that on folks without disabilities, that there's like some expectation that we have to reach before we are quote unquote ready to be, in a relationship with someone, and then if someone has a disability, then if you already have that conceptualization for someone that doesn't have a disability, for someone with a disability, it's like, oh, wow, this is so far gone from, anything that could possibly happen.
Right.
And how nasty is that? I mean, it's not like, people have needs and urges and wants, and, want social connection. It just might look topographically different for people, and that should be celebrated.
Exactly. This next item, I'm just going to kind of reiterate the trigger warning in case folks want to pause or fast forward a couple minutes, because we're going to touch a bit on assisted suicide and abortion. And so I'll pause for a second. If you're planning on collecting continuing education credits for this episode, you'll need to enter the 3 secret words at www.cbiconsultants.com/shop. The first secret word is Foxy. All right. If anyone still remained, you know what we're talking about. Things like assisted suicide and sort of automatic abortion, and just even in general. How do they play a role in stigma?
Yeah. So, I also just want to preface this with myself that I've never had direct contact or experience with any of these, and never had to make these decisions.
No.
So everything that I'm saying next is purely speculation, and from like a very high level, non-nuanced.
Absolutely. And I know, and I know that So just to sorry to interrupt. I know that when you were in your preprint that you put out, you are referencing some research and sort of studies and stuff. And I know none of this comes from your own personal experience, but this was just sort of
For sure.
there was some stuff referenced, I think, in the literature on this stuff.
For sure. Yeah. So in that line, there have been some instances of assisted suicide where maybe the person didn't necessarily want that, or that person was convinced that going on with a particular ailment or impairment or disability was not worth it. So that is, entirely pervasive in many cases. Now, in some cases, that might be warranted. And if the person really wants that, that is up to the person. It should not be up to doctors and families to tell that person what they want. So at the end of the day, I mean, that either side, on these decisions, it should not be left up to other people that aren't going to do that.
Yes.
Especially with the abortion component too, there's many, and I'm sure there's people that listen to this podcast that have had to make very, 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 very difficult decisions.
Absolutely.
And that is your decision to make at the end of the day. And, especially people that aren't able to, ever have to make that decision with their own bodies should not be the one making policies. So there's that.
100%. 100%.
But there's this idea of, like genetic testing ahead of time and saying like, okay, well, does your child show genetic signs of having a particular disability? And, having that choice, on the front end is kind of like saying like, well, do you want to have a child with a disability or do you want to abort and try again? And for some people, that can be an impossible decision to make for folks. We see on TikTok and other components a lot where, other people were asked this question and they're like, no, I want to keep my child. And they had a child with a disability and had a very great, wonderful life. And, in a way that was happy and defined by them and, hard, in ways that, only folks that experience that know how, but rewarding and good and positive. But some people might have to make a decision like that. Maybe there's a case where, you're like beyond cases of like maybe your child would not survive past a certain time, week or day. Maybe there's other considerations. So again, I'm not even going to pretend to know what any of those feel like. For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and
conceptualization. Oh, go for it.
No, I think, because you're absolutely right. I mean, we're not certainly talking about personal decisions here and personal experience. If anything, I think one thing we're talking about is maybe sort of government policy and whatnot. I know in Canada, at least, or certainly in my province, there's a group called Inclusion BC, which is essentially British Columbia is the province I live in, and essentially they're an advocacy group for folks with developmental disabilities, and they have had a lot of concern with sort of assisted suicide law in that. Certainly as it applies to certain, to I think what the policies were created for were for adults who are able to make decisions about their own health and typically have terminal illnesses that are just constant pain and discomfort and constant suffering and agony throughout, or constantly on heavy doses of medication to mitigate, which make them very unresponsive. And so basically just in some ways almost comparing themselves to being someone who is in a coma, and still feeling all those sorts of sensations, and that's what I think assisted suicide was designed for. But then the way the laws are written, they open up the door for, and I know the terms are probably different in the U.S., but essentially they open up the doors for sort of people to make decisions for them if they're now, from a legal perspective, now lacking that capacity. And
Yeah, so like power of attorney or something along those
exactly, yeah, and certain, and the problem is, and certainly if you have, maybe an individual who up until a certain point was able to make their own decisions and wrote their own will and said, I give the power to my husband or my spouse to sort of make that choice for me, if I can no longer. That's one thing. But I think the idea that there's a lot of adults, children and adults in particular with developmental and intellectual disabilities, that have these sorts of agreements in place. In our province, they're called representation agreements. The next level up is something called a committeeship, which is essentially, you and all of your rights are now removed. You are no longer a person under the law, and people can make decisions for you. And I've supported adults who have had these committeeships in place, and the people that sort of hold those rights can make all the decisions, including assisted suicide. And I think, and so that there's that fear, of sort of, almost a eugenics kind of repetition happening. And so, I can definitely see how those concepts can kind of feed into the stigma, like, and I sort of imagine being alive now. At least so you were fortunate enough to not be one that was subjected to one of those things, and you were able to now live your life. But there's still sort of the idea that there was an option, that someone could have decided that I can't live. Or so, and how that sort of plays into sort of my whole sort of outlook on life and perspective on myself and on others. It's wild.
Yeah. It's I don't know, and like I don't even know what even goes into all those decisions, but it's I'm sure that also opens the doors, like you said, for, well, this person must not ever want to live like this, and again, that goes back to like a lived experience piece of, you can say like, if I was in that person's shoes, well, that's you with your own learning history, and that person's shoes, that's not that person with their own learning history. So how can we take those empathetic approaches and ask? And, I'm sure that also complicates things like, if you don't have in those situations, like if you don't have a will and, something happens in the moment. And, I my cousin, when I was 4 years old, the family had to make a very hard decision to do that. They drowned, but they were still alive. But there was a lot of very difficult decisions around that, and a lot of things that, especially as a kid going through that, not understanding what's going on with your cousin was hard to see and unpack, and conversations you never hope to have with people, because it's there's a lot that goes into it. But to your point, I think there's slippery slopes with a lot of these things, and we need to be more mindful about, if we're putting policies in place to change the way people make choices, there need to be policies in place to have resources available when after those choices are made, or made for them, whatever that is. So
yeah, totally. If folks want to come back and listen again, I'll be sure to even jot the time down in the show notes of when to return to the podcast if you felt these were sort of triggering kind of topics. One last sort of item you talked about, and I think it's just really important to touch on all of these, because when we get into sort of the meat of your research around responding to stigma, I think there's I think folks really need to have a lot of these concepts in mind, because if anything, prevention is probably the best way to sort of reduce stigma, and thinking about some of these concepts and the way they work, and especially as a parent with young children like yourself, teaching these lessons to your kids so that early on, they're not developing kind of these perspectives. This last one though is a little less. Probably a little less sort of controllable. You talk a little bit about, again in the preprint, about the connection between evolution and genetics and stigma. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's been some work on this, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but it's kind of surveying the research. I think this idea of kind of separating yourself from other people, there are evolutionary benefits to that, right? Where it's like, this is my group versus a group that might potentially um, remove resources from me, from whatever that means, right? So, if you think like evolutionarily back in the day, is that like a hunter-gatherer type thing? Is that I am this, creature, and that thing is stealing my food? And then that becomes more complicated, over time, as we start doing vocalizations and things like, being out on, a prehistoric prairie is not really a thing as much anymore. And um, that starts getting into like, well, those people are taking my jobs, or these people are a burden on the system. And, there might be, and there's some suggestions around this for like stigma drives and whatnot, that there's a potential link to saying like, okay, this person is taking up X resources, and that's doesn't feel good for me. Right. There's not a ton of research in this area, and I don't know how valid this is. And, man, I super hope someone listens to this like 10 years from now, or 5 years from now, or next year. And it's like, hey, we like totally explained how this works and how to address it. So,
Nice. Yeah.
But that might be there. You might have your, potentially some, genetic component to distinguish yourself from others. And there's value to that. Like, I am different from you. I call myself something different. I dress different. Well, not too different. I think we have some of the same hats. But we have different beliefs and different learning systems. And, that's, to be able to distinguish between people is a pretty powerful survival tool, like who is going to give me reinforcement, who's not going to give me reinforcement.
Yeah.
And, there might be a connection there associated with stigma. But again, I mean, it kind of goes back to the implicit piece. Maybe you experience that and you go, you reflect, and you give yourself time to reflect and go, man, that was kind of a weird thought. How do I, where did that come from? What do I do with this?
Yeah, I'd be curious kind of what the the perspective of, folks like Steve Hayes and those guys that kind of have been diving a lot more into sort of this evolutionary psychology kind of perspective. Because it's not hard to sort of believe that, stigma has now become sort of a, in a way, part of the genome, because this is not a new sort of, phenomenon. This has been happening for, I think, as long as there's been, human beings on the planet. They've been, we've been, comparing ourselves and putting people into different categories. And often, and I mean, it's only up until really, the last couple of years that we've actually started to address some of the, long-term, effects of oppression, that particularly, sort of from a colonizing perspective that we put on folks, and that goes, and I mean, some of that stuff goes back thousands of years, and there's just so many, and certainly the inequality of men and women, and that goes back again, to time immemorial, and so it wouldn't be surprising that thousands and thousands of years of sort of, these perspectives and these beliefs have now sort of entered the genome. So yeah, if there is someone out there that's, maybe done this work, it'd be great for you to reach out, because I'm curious. Again, not a lot we can do about it here, sort of in the fly, but I think just something to be aware of. I mean, we know that genetics in general do not determine, it's nature and nurture, right? So it's not
exactly
the genes alone don't make the choices. So it's sort of it's sort of like saying boys will be boys, or those other sort of annoying phrases out there that sort of that's the way it's always been kind of thing. And so we assume that's the way it's got to be, but it doesn't have to be. Let's let's start looking at kind of the study a bit. And before we do that, I know this study is based on some other work and a bit of an extension of some work from Mark Dixon and his colleagues. And what did Dixon study, and what did his colleagues do?
Yeah, so in his set of studies, so there was a conceptual paper on RFT and terrorism and kind of where that comes from. Again, conceptual. And then there were two studies after that, really looking at individuals, from supposedly the Middle East, depending on a Google search, obviously there's many issues around that, but I think it was an interesting approach for that. And really kind of looking at like what, relational frames are kind of there, like what kind of, this was more, I guess, like a stimulus equivalence paradigm. And then there's a transformation of stimulus function. So there might be, more RFT components to that, but that's, something to dig into later. But really kind of saying like, okay, how does this individual view these people in the picture that you see? And, there was a variety of different pictures, folks with different backgrounds and then control pictures and things like that. So, saying like, okay, how likely are you to approach this person, or how safe, something along those lines. And essentially what was done then is, through like relational frame paradigms and through stimulus equivalence paradigms, it's, you start relating, A to B, B to C, and then you test A to C. So essentially taking this picture, relating it to some, arbitrary stimuli, I don't know, arrows, color, what have you. And then you relate that color to something else like capability, approachability, acceptability, things like that. And, words that are generally associated with that, if you opened up a thesaurus, like what's there. And then you start testing between the picture and this other relation that you had. So there's like this mediating stimuli in between. And, what they kind of found was, like through like kind of, pretty simple, 15 to 30 minute paradigms of, computer-based instruction, people's perception of, folks in the pictures changed to become more approachable and less like something that's associated with bad or something associated with terrorism, because this was shortly after 9/11, at least in the US here. So, there's a pretty powerful study to say like, okay, in this short amount of time, what can you do? What can you change? And, that was something that really interested me, especially, having, my own history with, folks, engaging in various microaggressions towards me and, ostracization from, my peers and, being called a host of names and, like, hey, y'all, if you're listening to this, look where I'm at. But it really got me thinking, can we use this paradigm for other perceptions and other prejudices and stigmas? And I wanted to apply that to, how do people view individuals with disability?
Really cool. Really cool. So the study actually doesn't, in the title anyway, doesn't reference stigma. You reference this concept of capability. What are you talking about there? What do you mean by capability?
Yeah, so, like when I'm looking at the past research and really trying to think about an operationalized stigma, I mean, how do we do that? And then how do you make that into a testable hypothesis? I imagine, like Skinner trying to think of verbal behavior. And, as we know, there's a lot of difficulties taking the book, a conceptual book, and trying to make it a measurement thing based on the terms. McCorkindale's got really good articles on why that was hard. But when you think of something like stigma, I really started, looking in the research and kind of saying like, okay, how did people break this down? Like, what are those measurable components of what stigma could potentially be? And one thing that kind of came up with previous research, through Patrick Corrigan's work at IIT, even the Alport stuff, in contact theory in 1950s, it really seemed to kind of boil down to how likely do you think this person is able to engage in life? And, I kind of broadly did that as capability. So, that's at least my own theory of that. And when you think of it that way, there's ways that you can measure that a little bit easier than just saying like, oh, here's your level of stigma. Oh, you scored a 5, you suck. But, the other piece that this came from was, even just asking around, thinking back to when I was a kid, but then also just asking around, like, you might say to someone like, oh, how, what do you think of this person with a disability? Like, oh, this person can do anything. They can blah, 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 and a lot of positivity associated with it. But then when you really started digging deep, like, is this person able to form close relationships? Is this person able to hold a job on their own? Is this person able to live on their own? And then you started seeing people kind of stray away and being like, well, I don't know, maybe with a lot of X, like a lot of support, maybe with, and it really got me thinking like, I don't know, maybe capability is the way to kind of approach this of, how likely is this person able to do these things, or how do you think that's going to happen? So that's kind of where the capability piece came from.
No, I like that. And I think there's actually someone put a study out recently, and I don't know if it's the same, and I'm totally basing this on the title, and I didn't actually read the article, so this could be a totally inappropriate relation. But there was a couple of recent articles that talk about sort of how to set up capable environments. Are you familiar with that work at all?
I can't think of that just right off the bat, but I mean, it's really that like environment of success, right? Like if you make it more.
I'll see if I can
better.
find it for the show notes, but I'm curious if there's a connection there. Anyway, kind of good. You've touched a bit on kind of RFT, and that's certainly I think the focus sort of framework of your work in this study, and we kind of touched on this a little bit at the beginning when we were just sort of trying to do a little bit of a review. But you've done a nice kind of RFT analysis of stigma, which I think is pretty cool. And I didn't. I think I'm glad I was able to interview a few folks before you, Vic Suarez. Again, my hands raised for your lovely. Simple explanation of some of the concept of RFT to me. I would not have a clue what Rocco's talking about today without you. I'm still a little mind-boggled by some of it, but it's starting to come together. I'm wondering if you could maybe just sort of, to give me the full analysis would essentially have you read 10 pages from your paper, so I won't make you do that, but if you could maybe just give me a bit of a summary of kind of what an RFT analysis of stigma looks like.
Yeah, so I think like the I guess Spark Notes version is everything that we see and everything that we do, as long as there's like memory associated with it or connection associated with it, kind of falls into at least how we understand it, kind of falls into these frames of how do you relate stimuli, right? So why is this an apple? Why is this a dog? Why is this your partner? Like how do those things relate? So then everything you come in contact with after that kind of builds into these other frames in your relational network overall. So, when we kind of think of like, okay, I saw this apple, and then you go to the grocery store and you're like, man, I'm looking for this red apple. And then you go to the grocery store and you see a green apple for the first time and you read the sign and you go, like, oh, this is a Honeycrisp apple. And you're like, oh, no shit, this isn't a red apple. So, your network expands and you're like, okay, well, apples can also be green and yellow and all sorts of colors. Then this gets complicated when you start thinking of things of like social rules. Right. So, you start thinking of like, oh, this is good. This is bad. Approach this person. Don't approach that person. Go in this neighborhood. Don't stop at the stop signs in this neighborhood. And, you have these base frames from your verbal community. Yes. And sometimes it could be contingency shape. And then people overgeneralize that to everything. Like, oh, I had a bad experience with this person once. And now everybody that reminds me of that person is linked to this initial aggressor or whatever. And that can create some pretty nasty, inappropriate connections, but the person is experiencing these things and that can be reinforced by the verbal community, that can be, reinforced, I guess, surreptitiously, or, maybe there's some kind of own reinforcement, you're building up your own biases and then you get a lot of confirmation for it. And you're like, oh, yep, look, that's what I thought. And you ignore all the other information around it. So, RFT then for me is, especially Jordan Belisle's work now with relational density as well, I think can really help expand on this and like how tied those connections are and how heavy they are, quote unquote heavy. But, for me, I think RFT offers a unique way to kind of dig into what those frames are, and are there ways that we can loosen those connections and add in something at the very least, a little bit more reflection of, like, instead of reacting right away, I see this thing, I have this function associated with this thing. And then if you can give yourself the time to say like, oh, that was weird. Like where did that come from? That can give you enough time to start introducing new information instead of being so fused and being very reactionary to the things you see around you. So that's kind of the basics of it.
So maybe just take us sort of through a kind of top level journey through the study. So what did it look like? What'd you do, and what'd you find out?
Yeah. So at the top level piece of this, to try to figure out what type of scale I wanted to use. So, I used, there's a lot of limitations associated with this, but the acceptance and action questionnaires, and there's a stigma version of this too. There's been some pretty interesting, Kraft had an article on this, connection between psychological flexibility and stigma. And, supposedly at its base, RFT and ACT are supposed to inform each other, although I would make the argument that ACT doesn't necessarily inform RFT, but that's another conversation. RFT then at the base can help to release and loosen up connections, and become a little bit more flexible with the things that you see in your environment. So those were kind of some of the measures used. But then as far as like looking at this capability idea, there's a great quality of life scale that Burkhart in 89 and Flanagan in 78 kind of, talked about and expanded on. And it would ask questions, just a bunch of questions about like relationships, needs, wants, things like that. And to shorten that up, to make sure that people are really attending to the question instead of just clicking, like 4 all the way through. Zacolto, was it like 2019, kind of found like some of the top 5 categories that were most related to capability. And it was, can this person get what they want? Can they form relationships? Can they help others? Can they understand their own strengths and weaknesses, however that's defined? And then can this individual participate in social activities? So we see some, I presented some GIFs or GIFs. I haven't decided which way I want to land on that one, of individuals that may or may not have disabilities based on YouTube searches and consulting with people and reaching out to the people in the YouTube videos as well, saying like, hey, is it okay if I use this? And that's something we've kind of expanded on. I'll talk about a little bit later. Nobody's done this as far as I know, at least in our field, with GIFs before. So like movement. So we had folks that, maybe engaged in stereotypy that weren't perceived to be in distress, at least as far as the folks in the video said. So I wanted to be very careful of that. I don't want folks in distress and say like, all right, let's use you for research. So, just seeing different movements. Then I had other like control pictures of folks that, maybe didn't have that. So you wouldn't know if that person had like a public accompaniment of things that you might relate to as a disability. There's a bunch of limitations around that, but I tried to do something a little bit different. So they saw these pictures, these GIFs, they would answer these questions, and then they moved on. So the relational training piece was, you'd see these GIFs on the bottom, you'd relate it to an arrow, and I would basically just say, hey, pick the best one that matches with this arrow. And, it was an arbitrary stimuli. So that like these arrows were like up and down, diagonal, and then there was like a weird, I don't know, squiggly one. I don't know, it's some kind of polygon. And I would reinforce, this is related to this. And the person had to figure it out, because we kind of see in some of the research that when someone kind of comes at the answer themselves, sometimes they maintain that relationship better, at least in the short term. Long term, I'm not sure. So they would relate, the initial pictures to the stimuli and to the arrow. And then we would do that again with words. So, like this picture would be related to up and down arrow. And then we would have words on the bottom, and the up and down arrow would be there. And it'd be something like capability or, power or I can't remember all the words I used.
Sure.
Skill, things like that. So then we tested between, the picture and the words and see if there's a relationship. And, some of it was reinforced, and then after a while it wasn't. And we just kind of saw what happened. How did people relate these pictures? And what we saw then at the end of the study was, people started seeing individuals in these pictures that, had maybe some kind of public accompaniment with movement or something along those lines. Again, I want to change that in the future too, with being more capable than they had before. And there was, not a huge statistical analysis for the study that was published on here. There's more of a single subject analysis, and something we're expanding later. But there was a switch in flexibility. There was an increase in perceptions of capability. And even afterwards, just from a qualitative standpoint, people were like, you know what? I kind of noticed myself responding differently to this picture than I did before. And it was pretty cool seeing that and seeing people answer that at the end, like, hey, I kind of changed my mind here for a second. So yeah, I mean, that was kind of the nuts and bolts. And, in a short amount of time, we were able to like momentarily change potential perceptions. Now, can that undo decades of life? Probably not. So there's more studies that we're going to do beyond that, but that's kind of the relationship we had there. And, the fastest person that did it was 10 minutes, and the slowest, I shouldn't say slowest, and the person that took the most time was about 2 hours to go through the whole thing. So people have different learning styles with that. So that was kind of an interesting measure to look at as well. Yeah. And that's kind of what we saw. And we're like, hey, there's something here, and we can kind of see which relational frames might be involved in stigma.
The second secret word is firefighter. Really cool. I think you touched on it already, but I think it's important to note that RFT in and of itself has not been around as a theory for that long, compared to sort of some other things. And so I think we're just starting to see some studies coming out where we're using RFT to sort of address some of these really important kind of social issues. But I think it's an important disclaimer for folks that it's really early days in sort of these studies. These are really kind of conceptual. It's not like we're suddenly going to have everybody starting their university career by taking an online training in RFT to sort of reduce their stigma or whatnot. I mean, it'd be awesome to see something like that one day. But this is really early conceptual stuff, and so I don't think folks need to sort of look at this as being, okay, how do I apply this and start reducing stigma tomorrow, or similarly to how do I to the implicit bias study that Vic Suarez did. She's not immediately going to start getting eradicating racism with a 20-minute computer program, but yeah. So but really kind of neat stuff. I noticed you were using this thing called this to measure capability, this general capability scale, and so this scale is essentially kind of a modified quality of life scale to measure capability. So there seems to be sort of an implication maybe that quality of life and capability are correlated. Do you think that's the case, or?
I at least theorized that maybe it is, right? So I definitely want to dig way more into that. Because again, I think stigma, kind of there's some connection between overt versus covert behaviors that I believe. And I don't know, maybe there's a bunch of other type of correlational studies we can do associated with this to start tightening that up a little bit.
Because I wonder if it and not certainly by any intention of yours or through the process of the study, but I'm wondering if somehow, this could even promote stigma in some ways.
Yeah.
I think about sort of just, I've talked about this on a few different episodes with a few different folks, and I talk about a lot with colleagues about just how, generally speaking, quality of life measures are so subjective. and sort of what and often this will be a trigger word for some folks, but often ableist, I think, in the way that, in the sense that they're often based on sort of norms that were created by folks that are neurotypical or whatnot, and so therefore are their one's perception of capability, I think, is linked to sort of one's perception of quality of life, where neither of those may actually be the perspective of the actual individual with a disability.
Exactly. And I think, Skinner talked a lot about this in the past too. I mean, just the very act of science is not beyond the bias of the scientist. And that's huge. I mean, that's a big piece on here. And looking at this own measure too. I mean, why are these the top things? And why is this something that we should measure people against? I mean, like, in a perfect world, it would be awesome if every study had some kind of like individualization of data based on that own person. Like, how does that person view success in life, and what has that wrought? And I think there's a lot of interesting pieces to do that. And 100%. I mean, engaging in this is, there's a lot of ableism that happens in this research, even with good intentions.
And the fact is, you got to get published, and journals are looking for data. They're looking for validated metrics and so on and so forth. And so, sometimes we've just got to use those tools to sort of, get the message out. I don't think the primary goal of your study was to, sort of promote the GCS as the almighty measure. But we've got to use them. I mean, I was talking to a recent guest, Chris Bigby, out in Latrobe in Australia, and she's been doing some really fantastic work around kind of measuring good quality versus sort of lesser quality group homes, and she's got a Ph.D. student that she had that designed this thing called the group home culture scale, and some neat guideposts around that, and so
nice.
a few really cool, and a few other measures. But the main point of the kind of the conversation that we had was that it's really difficult to come up with a measure, a generalized aggregate measure that's also individualized, and how could you? I mean, it's almost like like how do you create something that's generalized and individualized at the same time? I don't even know if that's possible.
Yeah, can you actually measure that if it's not like technically measuring the same thing?
Yeah. So it's tricky.
Then, does that make the research inherently ableist then too, right? Where like if the expectation is, we need stats on this and we need to measure this, are we forcing kind of that issue on other people? I think that's a very important question.
Well, yeah, I think in a way we are. I mean, I think in a way most of our research is inherently ableist. But is it the research that's an ableist, or is it the systems? I think it's the systems more that are ableist that you're sort of publishing in, like it's the policies of the particular journal, the rules around peer review, and sort of all these sorts of pieces that that have been in place for decades in journals across the sciences. I think there's some major systemic pieces that need to be addressed in there, and they're going to continue to be ableist, and there's really not much you can do about it, but you got to get your work out.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that, looking at this and with some of my students, Christy and Luke, I'm shouting out to you guys because you really helped me out with this. We were able to get a grant within our school to be able to have like consulting fees for engaging with autistic folks about talking about what type of research we want to try to do, what are considerations around the stimuli, around the measures. And then if there was any time that, someone was uncomfortable and multiple people were uncomfortable with that about a particular research topic, if there wasn't any way to alter that to the liking of the folks that we were working with, we just cut the study. We're like, okay, hey, this is not valid and we don't have to do this.
Cool.
Like we're not trying to, it was awesome. It was a really cool experience. And the students really, pushed my own bounds of like what science is and how to engage in that.
Yes.
And it was cool. We got, a good amount of people, under this, and I hope to continue this, especially with folks with other disability identities. And folks, listen to this. If you are listening to this, thank you so much for engaging in that. That was just so cool. And at the end of the day, a big question that we asked, beyond, is this relevant to you? Is this relevant to how you perceive, the field moving forward? If you want the field to move forward, we definitely had some feels of not. And I think that was very valid. We need that. But the last questions we would ask are, what level of involvement do you want in this study? Do you want to be referenced? Do you want to be part of the stimuli? One person just offered without us asking of like, hey, do you want to videotape some of my stereotypy or some of my, body movements and use that? And then some folks are interested in being, authors on the papers themselves. So, that's the type of, more like community participatory research.
Yes.
You're consulting, have the person on the damn, article. And sorry for swearing, but
no, please.
That's, I don't know. It just makes sense. So many of these articles are posted by folks that don't have that lived experience with the community. Yep. So maybe we need to have more research where someone is actually on there, someone's getting their authorship and their name out and really looking over the person's shoulder, instead of researchers saying, well, I'm going to do this with a bunch of folks, with this type of disability, and I'm going to publish this thing. And who gets the recognition at the end of the day of that? It's the researcher. It's not the people that were the participants or direct help or consultants associated with that. That just seems wrong.
I love that. I love that you're doing that. I think that's really forward thinking, and I think that's the way we should start to see research more and more. You touched on kind of two things that resonated really well with me in terms of a couple of guests I've had on recently. I don't know if you heard the episode with Dr. Cassio, Ariel Cassio at I forget where she's at now, but all her work is exactly kind of what you're talking about. It's looking at how do we, she was particularly looking at autistic folk, but how do we involve autistic folk in every single aspect of our research, going all the way back, and how do we make it inclusive at the same time? And so she talks about not only sort of going back to even the theoretical part of sort of coming up with a research question. So she involves the autistic folk in coming up with the research questions themselves. Design, the inclusion, the exclusion criteria, the recruitment, all those sorts of pieces. Then they go a step further, and if you're recruiting sort of autistic individuals, that may or may not have certain maybe sensory difficulties or whatnot, or other things that maybe the typical environments, can literally be painful for them. How do we design our research area to be, really accommodating for that and dealing with those pieces? And she actually has, focus groups with mostly autistic folk that are making all these decisions. So the whole process of research from beginning to end, to analysis, all the way to publishing, and then the pieces you're doing are as inclusive as they can possibly be. And she has, I think, 5 or 6 kind of guidepost recommendations for anyone doing research with anyone who's autistic, that, these are sort of basic sort of, respect and dignity and inclusive kind of practices that we should all be engaging in. And so it's just wonderful to hear that other folks are doing that, particularly folks that are doing the research in our field, because I think what you're doing is, I think it's really forward thinking and, and maybe a bit ahead of times. I think it should be, right on the money and what everyone should be doing right now.
Hey, and I appreciate that too. And, I think the other piece that always kind of got me with this type of research is, one, other fields have been doing this for decades. And
Mm-hmm.
especially fields in usability. I have a really close friend, Katie, that works in like human computer interaction,
Hmm.
and they work for a company in Chicago, around the Chicago area here, because that's where I'm from.
Mm-hmm.
And her whole job is to fly around for folks that are doing different types of research studies and asking these same questions, like,
Hmm.
who are you pulling for participants for things like a drug patch or a new
Mm.
um, like app for individuals that want to focus more on things. And that's our whole job, and there's research on that. And it's like, you're looking at this and you're like, man, like behavior analysis, we're really pushing forward, this is great. And it's like, sweet, maybe we've stepped into like the early 2000s
Mm-hmm.
with some of this. We're still so far behind on what other fields have been doing, and maybe we need to start saying, like, okay, if behavior analysis is here to save the world, other people have been doing better things and more refined things. Maybe we need to be reaching across the aisle more and saying, like, hey, how can we collaborate with other folks to do better research practices? Because there are models for that, but
Mm-hmm.
too many people poo-poo that because we're either in a silo on a pedestal, or
Yep.
we just don't care what other people think.
Well, I mean, I think I think this also kind of goes back to some of the stuff we were talking about around systems. Like,
Mm-hmm.
again, not saying Cassio's work is the end all be all, but let's just say the 5 guideposts that she wrote are, make a lot of sense and should
Mm-hmm.
be applied across all research. Then what we should be seeing is what we should be seeing happen is we should be seeing those publishers saying, okay, did you follow the 5 guideposts? You didn't?
Yeah.
Okay, we're not publishing. And that
Yeah.
becomes sort of the systemic sort of support for, those sorts of pieces. But right now,
Agreed.
anyone and their dog can publish what they're currently publishing, because those particular journals out there, those flagship journals out there, will accept that work based on this criteria and not this sort of upper level piece that really looks to kind of respect the people. And that's a lot of what I think, kind of circling back to kind of the pieces around reform. That's a lot of what autistic folk are looking for. They just want to be included in every aspect, and that seems to be the complaint over and over. And whether it be a big sort of parent advocacy organization that they struggle with, or an agency or research or whatnot, is sort of this either lack of inclusion of of autistic folk in all aspects, or they include autistic folks, but they're either in certain aspects, or they're folks that that they've sort of that are already employed by them, that tend to sort of agree with their philosophy and don't sort of think of sort of that wider picture. And so, yeah, I think I'm glad you're young, because I think that I would be sad to hear that you're retiring in 5 years and this work couldn't keep going. And so I'm hoping that you and your colleagues and your students and some of the other folks you mentioned already, will kind of continue that process, and we'll actually see a real change in kind of how we do research and what kind of questions we're asking, and because this is what the field is looking for, and it's great to know that there's some folks in the forefront. The third secret word is GIF. GIF. GIF.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those changes now, like even within research, I mean, we've had stuff rejected because it didn't meet better ethical standards with that. So I'm seeing the change on this end too, which is fantastic. And, I mean, the part that stinks is like, great, this would have been great about 15 years ago.
Yes.
But it's good that it's happening now. It's good that we're bringing this to the forefront. But I mean, people have been saying this for decades, so this is not like a new thing. So,
Yes.
I mean, I encourage everybody out there that's like, oh, this is the first time I'm hearing of it. And it's like, cool, like, welcome to the party. Like, people have been here for a bit. But, make those changes and challenge those systems, because you can. And I think there's more of a push and, a reckoning of accountability,
Yeah.
especially with all the things happening in the last couple of years in the world.
Absolutely. Yeah.
People are more open to that. So push.
Yeah, totally. We touched on this a little bit, but just to kind of wrap up, maybe if you can just share with us kind of what some of your cool upcoming projects are. What are you up to?
Yeah, so I'm actually working with a group right now, Jasmine, Melanie, and Natalia, in their doctoral programs, and Natalia's Dr. Natalia Virus. And so we're, I do want to be respectful of that as well. And we are putting out a paper that I'm really, really excited about. So hopefully it's, out and published by the time this is in here. At least people are like, hey, this seems like a cool thing. Looking at disability models and how do we apply that to behavior analytic work, and things like, social model disability, critical race theory. And it's a paper that's been in the works for like 3 years because we wanted to do it right and include authors that had lived experience around disability and the knowledge and the care associated with this, and having a wide, I don't know, just a diversity of authors and a lot of considerations behind that. So we really kind of put that to the test and wrote this paper that, I don't know, I think it's good, but I'm biased on that. So we're sending that in like today.
Wow.
It's finally there. We did it. And it's been great because, we were ready about a year ago, and then behavior analysis and practice and BSI just like pushed out like 3 different like special issues, and we're like, oh my gosh, there's gold here.
Yes.
And readjusted. Science is fluid. It can't be stuck in one way, and we can't say, well, this is right, this is what it is. Like when you find something interesting, drop everything and just look at it, analyze it. And so we have that. There's some more research that we're doing around the kind of the consulting work I was mentioning before. I have a really good team of folks, and we're going to be doing a lot of stuff starting up in the fall here, kind of as the semester wraps up. Some folks are going through like comps and dissertation and stuff right now. But, a lot of community work. We just wrapped up a grant with an acceptance and commitment training and behavioral skills training for parents and caregivers that don't have access to a lot of the behavioral services. And what does that look like, and how did we adjust our training associated with that? So we just finished that up, and we're going to continue more of that,
really
kind of
cool.
as pro bono work. Yeah. Some more, of the research, like expanding my dissertation here and this type of study. So really trying to say like, okay, what are some of these basic frames? And then how do we use that information to create more direct community and, human-to-human interface interactions, different maintenance goals. So we got a lot of cool stuff in the works over the next year here. So I'm really excited to push that forward. I'm really excited to have the team that I do at TCS. I mean, everybody, or at the Chicago Professional School of Psychology, the department's been supportive. The students have been super supportive and just excited and hungry for change and pushing that change themselves. So I am just, if y'all are listening to this, and you probably will, because I'm going to be sending this to you, just thank you so much for putting up with me and my ideas for getting that forward. So yes, I mean that this next year is going to be a busy year for us.
That's amazing. And well, I think you've also created just a whole slew of new podcast guests for me for the next couple of years. So I appreciate that as well.
Of course.
And I'll definitely be having you back as well, because I know there's going to be some really great stuff that we'll be able to talk about. So just thanks again for coming on. I know for those, I know we've had a couple rounds at this and some really good conversations sort of before and during, and I'm looking forward to staying connected, and really looking forward to getting this one out. So thanks again for being on the show.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.